Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the impact of the Labor and Unemployed Association in British Honduras. So in our previous class we were talking about the origins of the labor movements or the unionist movements in British Honduras, which occurred in 1930s, 1940s and 1950s. It is important to note that we were talking in our previous class about the impact of the Great Depression and the hurricane in British Honduras and the emergence of Antonio Soberanes as a leader or as a unionist leader in the settlement itself. So today we're going to be looking at the LUA. We're going to be looking at basically what occurred in the 1940s and what occurred in the 1950s as to how the unions progressed during Soberanes' time and actually after Soberanes' time. So way up to the emergence of what is later called or what was later called as General Workers Union. So today we're going to be looking at three different things. One, we're going to examine the British response to the activities of the Labor and Unemployed Association. So how is it or what is it that the British did as a result of all of this unionist movement and activities, demonstrations, picketings, walkouts and that sort of thing that the unions were promoting and doing? What did the British do against that? Secondly, we're going to be looking at the split that occurred between or in the Labor and Unemployed Association, and lastly we're going to examine the legacy of the Labor and Unemployed Association. So those are the three different things that we're going to be assessing for today. So one, explore what the British did against the LUA. Two, look at how the LUA basically had a split, and three, examine the legacy of the LUA. So to begin with, it is worth remembering or it is worth recalling that in our previous class we discussed that Antonio Soberanes was very active in the 1930s. He was a man that organized people, brought people together to fight for a common cause. But it is also worth remembering that at this point, British Honduras is going through one of the most trying, that is, economic periods in the history of British Honduras or in the history of Belize. When the Great Depression had just happened, there was widespread unemployment. The hurricane had destroyed vast parts of the city. There was hunger, there was poverty, homelessness. So British Honduras was going through a really tough time, and within that tough time, Antonio Soberanes emerged as a symbol of hope for British Honduras, and the British did not like that. The British did not like that, particularly because what Antonio Soberanes was doing is that he was promoting rebellion against the government, because Antonio Soberanes was leading people to go and fight for their rights and leading people to go and fight, as we had stated, just for employment. So it was not even about the raising of wages, but it was employment. So the British were upset about that, and the British began to create laws. So again, just like how the aristocracy did in the early days, where they created laws to benefit themselves, the British in this case began to create laws that would prevent people from fighting for their rights or prevent the workers from fighting. So what they did, one, they created laws in which they allowed the police to ban processions. So now they were creating laws that would avoid any sort of demonstration or any sort of gathering by the people. So Antonio Soberanes now could be charged if he would promote a procession in British Honduras. So that was the sort of thing that the British were trying to do. So they were trying to break up. That is what is called union busting. Secondly, the laws that the British created also gave the governor powers in the event of an emergency. So in the event of an emergency, the governor could call in the police and take violent action against protesters, for example. So if a riot went out of hand, they could use massive force against the people. And lastly, the laws also did not allow people to criticize the government. So now I want you to put this into perspective. One, they could not have big gatherings because or processions because they could be arrested, the laborers, that is. The governor had power of instructing the police force or the soldiers to use aggressive force against protesters or against rioters or demonstrators if he wanted so in the case of an emergency. And three, the laborers or the workers could not talk against the government. Very important things, right? So in a way, freedom to speech, freedom to demonstrate, freedom to assert your rights were all limited at this point by the government at that point. So these laws, as I had stated, were used against Soberanes when he was addressing a crowd in 1935 in Corozal. It was also used against other union leaders who would try to organize some sort of movement. So what the British were basically doing is that they were giving a soothing pill to all of these activities, and they were basically telling the unionists that they could not riot, they could not protest or demonstrate. Eventually, because or due to the pressure from the British authorities and due to the different interests, and we must understand that all of this is happening, right? The economic conditions are becoming better. Some people are getting jobs, so they are starting to move away from the unionism. Other people are becoming pressured by the British, so they decide to step aside to not be victimized. And this is what basically caused a split within the Labor and Unemployed Association. And they were, to an extent, very busy talking about each other because they disagreed as it relates to what are their goals and aims and activities. At this point, Soberanes decides to step back to an extent and go into the smaller communities, go into the districts to talk about the movement of unionism. And this, to an extent, is where he also did not put a lot of interest in Belize City. So Belize City was weakened as well. However, even though the Labor and Unemployed Association was a bit dwindling a bit, they won a constitutional change in which the British allowed for elected representatives and also allowed women to voice out gender issues. Now, this to an extent, or these aspects to an extent, are aspects that we sort of take for granted, that they are rights that are supposed to be there. However, if it was not for the movement of the unions, many of these things would have not been won at this particular period in time. So eventually, the unions, as I had stated, begin to dwindle. The unions begin to receive a lot of pressure from the government. They begin to receive a lot of pressure because the economic conditions are also influencing some of their members to leave the unions, and also because there is a split between the group. So eventually, by the late 1940s, early 1950s, the better economic conditions ends the unemployed brigade. Antonio Soberanes moves on to create what is called the British Honduras Workers and Tradesmen Union, and this was later renamed the General Workers Union. So up to 1947, the General Workers Union was still very active, and the General Workers Union had already created protests or gained momentum to such an extent that by 1947 the General Workers Union gained 60% wage increase for over 300 workers of the Belize State Company. So that is something that is very important. Again, it is the power of the union, the power of people coming together, the power of workers coming together. So with that said, what I want to state as well before we get into the work that I have for you today is the fact that these sentiments that the unions were bringing forward were sentiments that related to the idea of workers against the government, workers against the rich people. And what this created was a grassroots movement that was creating patriotism, stating Belize, or British Honduras in this case, Belize, should have its own representation and should have its own people making their own decision. So here you see that seeds of nationalism and patriotism are being planted. And this is what we're going to be seeing later on that influence the nationalist movement in British Honduras. So as I was stating, what I want you to do today is basically to write a stanza poem, three stanza poems, with 4 lines each. The poem is to be based on the content of what I taught you today. And I want you to submit it in a very simple form, which is on a YouTube video. The criteria for it is the content. I'm going to be looking at how you use the content for today's class. I'm going to be looking at coherence and structure, so how well you put the poem together. It's not just a jumbled up series of sentences or words, and your creativity and originality. Again, good luck. You have until the end of the week to complete this task. Thank you.